This is Crazy Karen HOA, and I have the paper trail. I work community events for a living, so I know how crowds move and how meetings actually run. That skill saved me when the Stonegate Reserve Terrace Association decided my fence was suddenly illegal, even though I had permits, measurements, and a contractor who swore everything was code. Welcome in, settle down, because this one gets messy. I moved to Quebec City 3 years ago because the job market was strong and I needed a reset after a bad financial year. I was rebuilding savings, paying down debt, and trying to stay invisible. The HOA here runs like a public shaming network where group emails get used like wanted posters, and every rule interpretation gets delivered with the confidence of a lawsuit you have already lost. For 2 years I kept my head down, paid dues on time, and avoided the neighborhood drama threads. Then my back fence started sagging, and I filed a permit to replace it. The permit came back approved in 4 days. I hired a contractor, ordered materials, and scheduled the install for mid-May. The old fence was 6 feet tall, weathered cedar that leaned like a drunk. The new fence would be 6 feet tall. Pressure-treated pine. Same setback, same footprint. Nothing fancy. I even sent a courtesy email to the neighbors on both sides with the timeline and contractor contact. Everyone said fine. No problem. Good luck. Then Teresa Wilson showed up in my driveway on install day, wearing a pink windbreaker and a black bucket hat, holding a coffee tumbler like she was about to crown someone with it. She is the safety committee chair, a role she uses like a badge to justify stopping into yards unannounced and interrogating people about imaginary hazards. She pointed at the stacked fence panels beside my truck and said, "This is not a fence, it is an encroachment." I told her I had a permit. She said permits do not override setback easements, and the HOA has the right to enforce compliance before construction starts. I asked what setback she was talking about. She said the fence had to be 18 inches inside my property line to preserve the easement corridor. I told her the city code only required 12 inches and my permit showed compliance. She said the HOA adopted a stricter standard 2 years ago and nobody told me because I did not attend meetings. I said I got meeting minutes by email and there was no fence policy update. She said minutes only cover votes, not committee guidance, and committee guidance is enforceable under the covenants. My contractor was standing there with a post hole digger, looking at me like he wanted permission to just start. I told Teresa I would pull the permit documents and we could compare measurements. She said measurements do not matter if the policy changed, and she would be filing a stop work request with the board that afternoon. Then she walked to her car, got in, and sat there typing on her phone for 10 minutes while my crew stood around burning billable hours. I went inside, pulled the permit file, found the survey, and checked the setback. 14 inches from the property line. Well inside the 12-inch city minimum, and if the HOA wanted 18, that was news to me and every other homeowner who had replaced a fence in the last 5 years. I took a photo of the survey and emailed it to the management company with a subject line that said, "Permit approved. Construction starts today. Please confirm no stop work order active." Management replied in 20 minutes, "No stop work order on file. Proceed per permit." I forwarded the email to my contractor and told him to start. He dug the first post hole, mixed concrete, set the post, and moved to the second hole. Teresa was still in her car, watching. When the second post went in, she got out, walked back over, and said, "I can make this a lean conversation in one email." I let her think I was cornered, because my trump card needed her to overreach. I did not tell her I had already requested a gate vendor service report 2 weeks earlier, when my side gate started locking me out. The vendor found the lockout was intentional configuration, not a glitch. And the config change happened the same week Teresa sent her first compliance email. That report was sitting in my inbox, time-stamped and vendor-signed, waiting for the moment she pushed too hard. She stood there waiting for me to fold. I said, "File whatever you want, I am following the permit." She said the permit does not cover HOA rules, only city code, and the board has discretion to halt construction for covenant review. I said the management company just cleared me to proceed, so if she wanted to override that, she could bring it up at the next board meeting. She said the next meeting was 3 weeks away and my fence would be done by then, which proves I am trying to bypass oversight. I did not take the bait. I said, "If you want to file something, file it. I have to leave for work at a hard start time and I am not spending my morning in a driveway argument." She said, "You think this is an argument? Wait until you see the hearing." Then she walked away. The fence went up over 3 days. The contractor finished on schedule, cleaned up and left me with a 6-foot-tall pressure-treated pine fence that looked exactly like the permit drawing. I walked the line with a tape measure and checked every post. 14 inches inside the property line, level across the top, gates swinging clean. I took photos of every section, saved them in a folder, and emailed a completion notice to the management company. 2 days later, I got a violation notice in my mailbox. It was printed on HOA letterhead with no signature, just a date stamp and a case number. The notice said my fence was installed without HOA approval, violated the setback easement, and created a safety obstruction for emergency access. I was given 7 days to submit a compliance plan or face a hearing. The notice also said a fine schedule would apply starting on day 8, $50 per day until resolution. I read it twice. The permit was city approved. The survey showed compliance. The management company cleared the work. The only person who objected was Teresa, and she had zero authority to issue violation notices. I called the management company and asked who authorized the notice. They said the safety committee has the right to flag compliance issues, and the board reviews them at the next meeting. I asked if Teresa could issue fines on her own. They said no. Fines require a board vote, but the notice itself is enforceable as a compliance hold. I said, "What is a compliance hold?" They said it means no exterior changes are allowed on my property until the issue is resolved. I said, "The fence is already done." They said, "Then you are in violation of the hold and subject to escalation." I asked what escalation meant. They said it could include forced removal, contractor penalties, or a lien filing depending on board action. I hung up and pulled the covenant documents. I found the section on compliance enforcement. It said the board has the right to enforce architectural standards, but enforcement requires a noticed hearing with the homeowner present and a majority vote to impose penalties. The safety committee could recommend action, but it could not unilaterally issue fines or order removal. Teresa was running a bluff, but she was doing it through official channels, which meant I had to fight it the same way. I started building my evidence file. I printed the permit, the survey, the contractor invoice, the city code section on setbacks, and the management company email clearing the work. I also printed the covenant section on enforcement procedures and highlighted the hearing requirement. Then I drafted a response letter to the board stating that I followed all applicable codes, the fence met city standards, and I requested a formal hearing to contest the violation. I mailed the letter certified and kept the receipt. Then I waited. The 7-day deadline came and went. No response. On day 8, I got another notice. This one said the compliance hold was now an active violation and daily fines would begin accruing as of that date. It also said the HOA reserved the right to contract removal of the fence and bill me for costs if I did not submit a removal plan within 14 days. I called the management company again. I asked if the board had voted on the fine. They said the board delegated fine authority to the safety committee for urgent compliance matters. I said, that is not in the covenants. They said it was approved in a committee resolution last year. I asked to see the resolution. They said committee resolutions are internal and not distributed to homeowners. I said, so Teresa can fine me without a vote, and I have no way to appeal until the next board meeting. They said I could request an emergency hearing, but emergency hearings require a $50 filing fee and are only granted for issues that threaten health or safety. I said, my fence does not threaten anything. It is 14 inches inside my property line and matches every other fence on this street. They said the safety committee disagrees and the board will make a final determination at the next meeting. I went to the neighborhood group chat and posted a question. I asked if anyone else had replaced a fence in the last 2 years and whether they had to go through a safety committee review. 3 people replied. One said he replaced his fence in 2023 and never heard from the committee. Another said she got a courtesy inspection but no violation. The third said the HOA only cares about front yard structures and back fences are owner discretion. Nobody mentioned an 18-inch setback rule. I screenshot the replies and added them to my evidence file. Then I went to city planning and requested the last 5 fence permits issued in Stonegate Reserve. The clerk pulled the records and printed them for me. All 5 permits showed setbacks between 12 and 15 inches. None were flagged by the HOA. I asked the clerk if the HOA had filed any objections or stop work requests in the last 2 years. She checked the log and said no. I took the permit records home and added them to the file. Then I called a friend who works in code enforcement. I explained the situation and asked if the HOA could impose a stricter setback than the city code. He said, technically yes, if it is in the covenants, but they have to apply it evenly. If they are only enforcing it against you, that is selective enforcement, and you can challenge it. He also said, if the city approved your permit, the HOA cannot force you to remove the fence unless they prove it violates a recorded covenant or creates a hazard. I asked what counts as a hazard. He said, blocking emergency access, obstructing sight lines at intersections, or encroaching on utility easements. Your fence does not do any of that, so they would have a hard time making the case. I thanked him and went back to the covenants. I found the easement section. It said utility easements are 10 feet wide and run along the rear property line in some lots. My lot did not have a recorded easement. The survey showed no easement corridor. Teresa was inventing a requirement that did not exist. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA chaos where the rulebook becomes the comeback. I decided to escalate. I filed a complaint with the management company alleging that Teresa was manipulating minutes and agendas to erase objections after meetings. I attached the permit records, the survey, the city code, and the neighbor replies showing uneven enforcement. I also requested a copy of the committee resolution that supposedly gave Teresa fine authority. The complaint went in on a Monday. By Wednesday, I got a reply from the board president saying my complaint was received and would be reviewed at the next board meeting, which was still 2 weeks away. 2 weeks of $50 per day fines. $700 if the board did nothing. I did not have $700 to burn. I was rebuilding my finances after a bad year, and I could not absorb bogus fees while waiting for a meeting that might not even rule in my favor. I needed to force action before the meeting, and that meant going public. I drafted a letter to the full board and copied every homeowner email I could find in the neighborhood directory. The letter laid out the timeline, the permit approval, the survey compliance, the selective enforcement, and the invented easement rule. I also included the fact that Teresa had threatened a lien before I even finished the fence, which showed intent to harass rather than enforce. I ended the letter with a request for an emergency board session to halt the fines pending a proper hearing. I sent the letter on Thursday night. By Friday morning, my phone was ringing. 3 board members called me within an hour. The first one said he had no idea Teresa was issuing fines, and he thought the fence issue was just a courtesy review. The second one said she was not aware of any committee resolution giving Teresa fine authority, and she wanted to see the documentation. The third one, the board president, said he was calling an emergency session for Saturday morning and I should be prepared to present my evidence. I showed up Saturday at 9 with my tabbed binder and my evidence file. Teresa was already there, sitting in the front row with her coffee tumbler and a clipboard. She did not look at me when I walked in. The board president called the meeting to order and said we were here to review a compliance dispute regarding a fence installation and an associated fine schedule. He asked me to present my case first. I opened the binder and started with the permit. I said, the city approved this permit on May 4th. The survey shows a 14-inch setback, which exceeds the 12-inch city minimum. I handed copies to the board. Then I pulled the contractor invoice and said, the work was completed on May 23rd. I notified the management company the same day. The management company confirmed no stop work order was active. I handed over the email. Then I pulled the violation notice and said, 2 days later I received this notice claiming my fence violated a setback easement. I asked the management company what easement. They could not provide one. I went to city planning and confirmed my lot has no recorded easement. I handed over the survey and the city easement map. Then I pulled the neighbor replies and said, I also checked with other homeowners who replaced fences recently. None of them were required to meet an 18-inch setback. I handed over the screenshots. Finally, I pulled the covenant section on enforcement and said, according to the covenants, fines require a board vote after a noticed hearing. I never received a hearing notice. I never had an opportunity to contest the violation before fines started accruing. The safety committee does not have unilateral fine authority under the covenants. I handed over the highlighted covenant page. The board president looked at Teresa and said, do you have a response? She stood up, opened her clipboard and said, the fence is not the issue. The issue is that he installed it without HOA approval, which is required under Section 12 of the Architectural Standards. I interrupted and said, Section 12 applies to new structures, not replacements. A fence replacement on the same footprint is considered maintenance, not new construction. Teresa said, maintenance does not require a permit. If he filed a permit, it is new construction. I said, I filed a city permit because the city requires permits for fence replacement regardless of footprint. That does not convert it into HOA new construction. She said, the HOA has the discretion to interpret standards, and the safety committee determined this fence required approval. One of the board members, a woman in her 60s, raised her hand and said, when did the safety committee make that determination? Teresa said, at our April meeting. The board member said, I did not see that in the April minutes. Teresa said, it was a committee meeting, not a board meeting. The minutes are not published. Another board member, a man in a polo shirt, said, so you are saying you made a policy decision in a committee meeting and applied it retroactively to his fence? Teresa said, It is not retroactive, it is interpretive. The policy has always been there, we are just enforcing it consistently now. I said, if you are enforcing it consistently, why are there 5 other fences installed in the last 2 years with no safety committee review? Teresa said, those were different situations. I said, how? She said, they were front yard fences. I said, no, they were not. I have the permit records right here. 3 of them are backyard fences with setbacks under 15 inches. None of them got flagged. Teresa looked at the board president and said, this is turning into a witch hunt. I am trying to protect the neighborhood from liability, and he is making it personal. The board president said, nobody is making it personal. We are just trying to understand the process. If the safety committee is enforcing a standard, we need to know what the standard is and how it is being applied. Teresa said, the standard is in the covenants. The board president said, which section? Teresa said, the easement section. The board president said, his lot does not have an easement. Teresa said, all lots have implied easements for emergency access. The board president said, implied by who? Teresa did not answer. The board member in the polo shirt said, I think we need to table the fine and schedule a proper hearing. The board president said, agreed. I am suspending the fine pending a full board review. We will add this to the agenda for the next regular meeting, and we will notify all parties in writing. Teresa said, you are setting a precedent that people can ignore the committee and appeal to the board whenever they do not like a ruling. The board president said, the committee does not issue rulings, it makes recommendations. The board makes rulings. That is how the covenants work. Teresa sat down hard and did not say anything else. The meeting adjourned 10 minutes later. I walked out with the fine suspended and a hearing date 3 weeks away. I thought that was the end of the ambush phase. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, an HOA vendor showed up unannounced with a clipboard and tried to step into my yard. He said he was there to inspect the fence for code compliance. I asked who sent him. He said the safety committee requested a third-party review. I said, I did not authorize anyone to enter my property. He said the HOA has access rights under the covenants for inspection purposes. I said, show me the covenant section. He did not have it. He just had a work order with Teresa's name on it. I said, you are not coming in without written authorization from the board. He said, I am just doing my job. I said, your job does not include trespassing. He left. I called the management company and reported the attempted inspection. They said they had no record of an inspection request. I said, Teresa sent a vendor to my property without board approval. They said they would look into it. An hour later, the board president called me and said the inspection was not authorized, and he had contacted the vendor to cancel the work order. He also said he was going to have a conversation with Teresa about overstepping her committee role. I thanked him and hung up. Then I got an email from Teresa. It said, you are creating a hostile environment for volunteers who are trying to keep the neighborhood safe. Your refusal to cooperate is noted and will be included in my report to the board. I did not reply. The hearing was set for June 15th at 7 in the evening. I spent the 2 weeks leading up to it organizing my evidence and preparing a presentation. I made a timeline, printed photos of the fence from every angle, and compiled a comparison chart showing the 5 other fences with similar setbacks and no violations. I also contacted my city code enforcement friend and asked if he would be willing to attend as a witness. He said yes. On the day of the hearing, I arrived early and set up my materials on a side table. Teresa was already there with her clipboard and a stack of printed emails. The board members filed in and took their seats. The board president called the meeting to order and said we would begin with my presentation, followed by Teresa's response, and then a board discussion and vote. I stood up and walked through my timeline. I showed the permit approval, the survey, the contractor completion, the management company clearance, and the violation notice. I pointed out the 2-day gap between completion and violation, which showed Teresa had no issue with the fence until after it was done. I showed the neighbor replies and the city permit records proving selective enforcement. Then I introduced my witness, the city code enforcement officer, who confirmed that my fence met all city standards and that the HOA could not impose a removal order without proving a covenant violation or hazard. Teresa stood up for her response. She said the fence was installed without HOA approval, which violated the architectural review process. I interrupted and said, the covenants exempt replacements on the same footprint. She said, your fence is taller than the old one. I said, it is the same height, 6 feet, which is standard and code compliant. She said, I have photos proving the old fence was shorter. She pulled out a printed photo and handed it to the board. The photo showed my old fence from a side angle. It looked shorter because the ground sloped and the photo was taken from the low end. I pulled out my own photo of the old fence taken from the high end, showing the full 6-foot height. I said, this is the same fence from a different angle. The height was always 6 feet. Teresa said, you are manipulating evidence. I said, I am providing context. The board president said, let's move on. Teresa said, fine. The real issue is the easement encroachment. The fence is inside the easement corridor and blocks emergency access. I said, there is no easement on my lot. She said, there is an implied easement for all rear yards. I said, implied by what document? She did not answer. The city code officer raised his hand and said, I reviewed the lot survey and the city easement map. There is no recorded easement on this property. If the HOA wants to claim an implied easement, they need to provide a recorded plat or covenant that establishes it. Teresa said, it is established by common practice. The officer said, common practice is not a legal easement. The board president said, do we have any documentation of an easement requirement? One of the board members said, I have been on this board for 6 years, and I have never seen an easement policy for rear yard fences. Another board member said, I replaced my fence 4 years ago and nobody mentioned an easement. Teresa said, that was before we tightened enforcement. I said, if enforcement changed, when was it announced? Teresa said, it is part of the committee guidance. I said, committee guidance is not enforceable unless it is published in notice to homeowners. She said, the covenants give the committee discretion. I said, the covenants give the board discretion. The committee makes recommendations. The board president said, I think we have enough information. Let's move to discussion. The board member in the polo shirt said, I do not see a covenant violation here. The fence meets city code, it is on the same footprint as the old fence, and there is no recorded easement. The fine should be voided and the violation dismissed. The board member in her 60s said, I agree. I also think we need to clarify the committee's role in enforcement so this does not happen again. Another board member said, I want to address the vendor incident. Sending an inspector to someone's property without board approval is not acceptable. Teresa said, I was trying to get an objective assessment. The board president said, the board authorizes inspections, not the committee. That is in the bylaws. The board took a vote. 4 members voted to dismiss the violation and void the fine. 1 member abstained. Teresa did not vote because she is not a board member. The board president said, "The violation is dismissed. No fine will be assessed. We will also be updating the enforcement policy to clarify committee and board roles. This matter is closed." Teresa stood up and said, "This is a mistake. You are gutting the safety committee's ability to protect the neighborhood." The board president said, "The safety committee can still make recommendations. It just cannot issue fines or order inspections without board approval." Teresa said, "Then I am resigning from the committee." She picked up her clipboard and walked out. I stayed for the rest of the meeting. The board discussed updating the architectural review process to include clear timelines and appeal rights. They also agreed to publish committee meeting summaries so homeowners would know when policies were being discussed. The meeting adjourned at 9. I packed up my materials and left. I thought that was the end. It was not. A week later, I got a payment demand from the gate vendor. It said I owed $600 for a service call and gate motor replacement that happened in April. I called the vendor and said, "I never requested a service call in April." They said the work order was submitted by the HOA Safety Committee for a malfunctioning gate lock. I said, "My gate was not malfunctioning, it was locked out." They said the work order described it as a malfunction, and the committee authorized the repair. I asked for a copy of the work order. They emailed it over. The work order was dated April 28th, 2 days after Teresa's first compliance email. It said the gate lock was reprogrammed to restrict access pending a compliance review. I read that line 3 times. The vendor had locked me out on Teresa's orders and billed me for it. I called the vendor back and said, "This was not a repair, this was sabotage." They said, "We followed the work order as submitted. If there is a dispute, you need to take it up with the committee." I said, "The committee does not have the authority to lock my gate or bill me for vendor work." They said, "We were told the committee manages common area access." I said, "My gate is not a common area, it is my private property." I hung up and called the board president. I explained the situation and forwarded him the work order. He called me back 20 minutes later and said, "This is unbelievable. I am scheduling an emergency session. We need to address this immediately." The emergency session happened 2 days later. I brought the work order, the vendor invoice, and the gate vendor service report I had been holding since May. The report showed the lockout was intentional configuration, not a glitch, and the configuration was changed on April 28th, the same date as the work order. I walked the board through the timeline. Teresa sent her first compliance email on April 26th. 2 days later, she submitted a work order to lock my gate. The vendor configured the lock to restrict access and billed me for the service. I did not discover the lockout until early May, when I tried to use the gate and found it would not open. I requested a service report, and the vendor confirmed the lockout was deliberate. The board president said, "Did Teresa tell you she was locking your gate?" I said no. The first I heard of it was when I got the vendor invoice last week. He said, "So she locked your gate, billed you for it, and never notified you or the board?" I said, "Correct." And she did it 2 days after threatening to make this a lien conversation in one email, which proves it was retaliation, not safety enforcement. One of the board members said, "This is beyond overreach, this is abuse." Another said, "We need to terminate the vendor relationship immediately." The board president said, "Agreed. We also need to refer this to legal counsel to determine if the HOA is liable for the vendor charges." Then I played my trump card. I said, I also want to request a temporary order to stop all enforcement actions against my property while this dispute is reviewed. The board president said, I do not think that is necessary. The violation has already been dismissed. I said, Teresa resigned from the committee, but she is still a homeowner, and she still has access to vendor relationships and HOA communication channels. I want a formal board resolution barring her from initiating any inspections, work orders, or compliance actions without board approval. The board president looked at the other members. One of them said, I support that. Another said, I do too. The board took a vote and passed the resolution unanimously. Teresa was barred from acting on behalf of the HOA in any enforcement capacity pending a legal review. The board also voted to cancel the vendor contract and demand a refund of the $600 charge. The vendor issued the refund within a week. But the real payoff came at the next public meeting. Teresa showed up even though she had resigned from the committee. She sat in the back row with her coffee tumbler and waited for the open comment period. When her turn came, she stood up and said the board was undermining safety enforcement and allowing homeowners to bypass rules with legal threats. She said my fence was still an encroachment and the board had caved to pressure instead of protecting the neighborhood. The board president let her finish. Then he said, Thank you for your comments. I want to address a few points for the record. He pulled out a printed timeline and said, On April 26th, you sent a compliance email regarding a fence that had not yet been installed. On April 28th, you submitted a work order to lock the homeowner's gate without board authorization. On May 2nd, you issued a violation notice without a board vote. On May 9th, you sent an unauthorized vendor to inspect the property. On May 23rd, you presented altered evidence at a hearing to support a non-existent easement claim. He continued, Your own work order proves the gate lockout was intentional configuration, not a repair. Your own compliance email proves you targeted the homeowner before construction even started. And your own hearing testimony proves you misrepresented the fence height and the easement requirement. The board has reviewed all of this evidence, and we have determined that your actions constitute harassment and abuse of committee authority. Teresa's face went red. She said, I was protecting the neighborhood. The board president said, You were retaliating against a homeowner who challenged your interpretation of the rules. The board has voted to void every warning and notice you issued during your tenure as Safety Committee Chair and to refer your conduct to legal counsel for further review. Then he said, We have also received documentation showing you are not current on your own HOA dues. You owe 3 months of back dues plus late fees. Under the covenants, homeowners who are delinquent on dues are not eligible to serve on committees or vote in elections. Your committee appointment was invalid from the start. The room went silent. Teresa stood there holding her coffee tumbler like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Then she turned and walked out. She did not come back. The board voted that night to update the fence policy with clear measurements and setback standards that matched city code. They also passed a resolution requiring all committee actions to be reported to the board within 48 hours and all enforcement actions to be approved by the board before notices are issued. The new policy voided every warning Teresa had issued during her crackdown and refunded any fines that had been paid under her authority. I got a formal letter from the board a week later. It said the violation against my property was dismissed with prejudice, all fines were voided, and the HOA would be covering my legal consultation costs as a gesture of goodwill. The letter also said the vendor contract had been canceled, and the vendor relationship tied to the abuse was terminated. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage next to the fence permit. Teresa moved out of the neighborhood 6 months later. I heard through the group chat that she bought a condo in a building with no HOA and no outdoor space. I did not follow up. My fence is still standing. It is level, solid, and exactly 14 inches inside my property line. Every time I walk past it, I think about the string line we pulled tight in my side yard, the pry bar lying on the ground like a threat, and the maintenance worker in the reflective vest who watched the whole thing and never said a word. I also think about the moment at the public meeting when the board president read the timeline aloud and Teresa's own clip proved the opposite of her claim. That moment, where the minutes turned against her and her timeline collapsed under timestamp evidence, made every hour of document prep worth it. The HOA runs smoother now. The new safety committee chair is a retired firefighter who actually knows code and does not use the role as a weapon. The board publishes committee summaries every month, and enforcement actions get noticed in writing with appeal timelines. People still complain in the group chat, but the complaints are about leaf blowers and parking, not harassment and retaliation. I still work community events, and I still know how meetings run. That knowledge saved me once, and I keep it sharp in case I ever need it again. Thanks for watching. I will see you in the next HOA story.